we want to look at some ways that we can work with strings in Python. And Python gives us several built-in ways that's kind of interesting because of the way the string is stored in Python. If you're familiar with working with lists, you're going to find that working with strings is actually very easy because Python has gone in and created a lot of similarities in how they do different operations. This makes it easier to learn and use Python. Now, in this first example, I have a variable called name. And inside that variable, I have a string called Tom Morrow. So I want to iterate over each character. And I can actually access each individual character in Python. And here's a perfect example of that. When I run this script, you'll notice that it prints each character on a separate line, just as print does. So I can access each individual element using a for loop as I iterate over my string one character at a time. This actually has quite a bit of functionality for us. In this example, I'm doing a very similar thing, but I want to count how many times the letter O appears inside of my name. So I iterate over each list, and I take a count, incrementing one at a time each time I find a letter I'm interested in. When I go through, I can find and do a proper count. I can change my string and this will still work. In fact, with just a little bit of modification, I can find out how many times each individual letter occurs in a given string, or if it even occurs at all. But let's look at what happens if I want to individually access a character. So I don't want to loop over the whole thing, I just want to get access to it. Well, I can use the bracket notation, just as I would with a list, to reference an individual character. And as you can see on line 3, I can use a negative index to move from the end of my string backwards. So I can move forwards, starting at 0, or move backwards. Now, the other interesting thing about this, though, is if I pick like what you see on line 5, there's not 22 characters in my string. Remember, starts at 0, and so 21 would actually be the 22nd letter. So if I run this, we'll get an error. In my first two lines where I'm printing out, notice they both happen to print an O. And that's just because of the name that I'm using. However, for my last print statement, because there is no string index of 21 in this particular string, I get an out of range exception. Let's take a look at what would happen if I changed those particular values, though. And change that to be a 2. That to be -5. I'm going to switch that to 12. Run this file again. Notice that my M, and I happen to pick an O again for my second one, still don't have enough characters to get to the 13th element. I have to pick something that's small. A quick and easy check on this is I can use the ling command to make sure I never go past that element. So just a little trick if I'm going to run into an issue. If you're used to working with lists, you might be familiar with slicing, where you can get a group of elements in the middle of your list. Well, in strings, I can get a substring, and here's a perfect example. I have a name, Edgar Allan Poe, and I want to get the middle name. So I'm going to start at index 6 and go through 11, and then I'm going to print it out. Notice when I print out, I get Allen, just as you would expect. You have to kind of count that out. That's okay. But this is a good and simple way for me to go through and get a substring. Now, a lot of languages have different ways of getting substrings. This is a pretty simple and straightforward method. But you might say, well, what happens if I want to get the end of a string or beginning of a string? Well, let's take a look at those examples. Notice here I have two more slices, one for my first name and one for my last name. However, in my first slice, to get my first name, I leave the first element blank. This is just going to say, get me the first 5 characters. Likewise, with my last name, I'm going to say, start at character index 12 and get until the end of the string. In both cases, I'm still using my slice, I'm just using it a little bit differently. With last name, I said I'm starting from the left-hand side, and I'm saying go to the end of my string, however many characters that is. With first name, no starting point, which means it's going to start at 0 and get 5 characters. When you test this out, it gives you the results that you would expect based upon what we typed in. Now with slices, you can do something that's kind of weird, and we want to be careful of. So first thing we're going to do is look at this example. And if you just notice it, it's just a bunch of digits and special characters. If you look at our print examples, notice our slice has not 2 numbers, but actually 3. A starting number, an ending number using the ling command, and then a third number. Well, that third number says how many characters should you pull. 2 being every other character, 3 being every third character. So it gives you an idea of being able to skip characters. So you're pulling from, in this case, the entire string, but you're not pulling every character. So it's just kind of an interesting little thing that you can do with a string slice inside of Python. Just to see this working, we go through and run it. Notice that in our first example, we print out our odd numbers and continue with the every other instance of our special characters. Whereas with our second print line, we again start at our first index and continue on, but print every third element. So we're skipping 2. So just an interesting thing that you can kind of do with string slices. Not used a lot, but when you need it, it is there and available for you very, very easily, especially compared to some other languages. Now, if you're used to working with strings, you know how important substrings are, and we've seen that, but the other thing you have to work with a lot is finding a substring. And so finding a substring becomes pretty easy inside of Python as well. Here's our example. We have completed, and it's a list of names separated by space. And we could do this with a list, but in this case, we for some reason just got in a long string, and this happens occasionally. We then have a variable called findIt, which we get from input from the end user. We use the in command. The in command is looking to see if findIt is inside of completed. If it is, it returns a true, and our true element block of our if statement runs. If not, we use the else. We go run this. I'll put in first an example of someone who's not in there. Notice it comes up, it could not find Beth, and so it printed out Beth was not found. If I run this again, I'll look for someone who is there. In our second example, we were able to find Mike, and therefore his value is returned and the true statement is printed. So that's a really good thing as well. If you're experienced in working with Python and conditional statements, you're probably also familiar with the not keyword. With just a little bit of modification, I can say if findIt not in completed. This would be looking for if something wasn't found. And so this provides a lot of strength in what we can do with Python when we're looking for and finding substrings. So these are just some basic ways that you can work with strings using Python.